This is a shipping container, 20 feet of corrugated steel, capable of holding 22 tons of cargo. Looks like every other container stacked on every other dock on every other coastline. Costs about $4,000 used, $8,000 new. Utterly unremarkable, until you realize that every container entering or leaving East Africa must pass through infrastructure that Kenya now exclusively controls. 3 days ago, Kenya decided to monetize that control. On January 22, 2026, at 6 a.m. Nairobi time, President William Ruto announced the East African Maritime Sovereignty Initiative, a comprehensive restructuring of port operations, transit fees, and trade corridor management that transforms Kenya from regional logistics provider to continental choke point controller. The initiative raises transit fees by 340%. It imposes new sovereignty surcharges on cargo destined for landlocked nations. It requires all East African shipping to clear through Kenyan-controlled facilities regardless of final destination. It creates a pricing structure that extracts maximum value from geography that 300 million people depend on for access to global markets. Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of Congo. Each landlocked nation depends on Kenyan ports and corridors for survival. Their imports arrive through Mombasa. Their exports leave through Mombasa. Their economic futures route through Kenyan infrastructure. Kenya just put a price on that dependency. The price is 340% of what it was last week. This is not port management. This is the weaponization of geography against nations with no alternatives. Here's what they're not telling you. Kenya's port leverage has been understood but underutilized for decades. The colonial-era railway from Mombasa to Kampala created logistics corridors that independent African nations inherited but never restructured. Mombasa handles 34 million metric tons of cargo annually, approximately 70% of all East African seaborne trade. The standard gauge railway, completed in 2017 with Chinese financing, connects Mombasa to Nairobi and extends toward the Ugandan border. The Northern Corridor, road and rail infrastructure linking the coast to the Great Lakes region, carries 80% of Ugandan trade, 90% of Rwandan trade, and essentially 100% of Burundian trade. No alternative routes exist at comparable scale. Tanzania's Dar es Salaam port serves southern routes but lacks capacity for northern traffic. The proposed Lamu Port South Sudan-Ethiopia transport corridor remains years from completion. Djibouti serves the Horn of Africa but cannot reach the Great Lakes region. Kenya's geographic monopoly is absolute. The initiative monetizes that monopoly. At 8:30 a.m. Nairobi time on January 22nd, I obtained the initiative's implementation documents through a source in Kenya's Ministry of Transport. The documents reveal fee structures that transform regional trade economics. Current Mombasa port fees: approximately $180 per 20-foot container, TEU, for local handling, plus $420 per TEU for transit cargo destined for landlocked neighbors. New fee structure: local handling, $290 per TEU, 61% increase. Transit cargo base fee, $1,430 per TEU, 240% increase. Sovereignty surcharge, $580 per TEU. Infrastructure maintenance levy, $320 per TEU. Corridor security fee, $180 per TEU. Total transit cargo cost, $2,510 per TEU, a 498% increase from current levels. The surcharges are designed to obscure the total increase. No single fee rises by 498%. But the cumulative effect transforms import costs for landlocked nations. A Ugandan manufacturer importing machinery pays $1,600 more per container than last week. A Rwandan retailer importing consumer goods pays the same premium. A South Sudanese humanitarian organization importing food aid pays the same premium. The increases apply regardless of cargo type, origin, or urgency. Medical supplies pay the same surcharge as luxury goods. Emergency food aid pays the same levy as electronics. At 10 a.m. Kampala time on January 22nd, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni held an emergency cabinet meeting. Uganda's response came within hours, a statement calling the initiative economic warfare against brother nations, and announcing suspension of all Kenyan agricultural imports. The suspension is symbolic rather than substantive. Kenya exports approximately $400 million annually to Uganda. Uganda's trade through Kenya exceeds $6 billion. The leverage asymmetry is catastrophic. At 11:30 a.m. Kigali time, Rwandan President Paul Kagame addressed Parliament. His statement was notably measured, revealing the calculation of a leader with no good options. Rwanda has pursued diversification of trade routes for years precisely to avoid the vulnerability we now face. Our efforts have been insufficient. We must accelerate alternatives while managing the immediate reality. Kenya has the right to set port fees. We have the right to respond as our interests require. The measured tone masked fury. Rwanda has worked since the 1994 genocide to build economic independence. The initiative demonstrates how dependent Rwanda remains on infrastructure beyond its control. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. Kenya frames the initiative as fair compensation for infrastructure services. The framing obscures what's actually happening. The infrastructure Kenya operates was largely financed by others. The standard gauge railway was built with $4.7 billion in Chinese loans. The Mombasa port expansion was financed by Japan and the World Bank. The Northern Corridor roads were funded by international development partners. Kenya contributed land and labor. International capital contributed most of the money. Now Kenya captures the revenue while debt service continues. The captured revenue is substantial. Transit traffic through Mombasa totals approximately 12 million TEU equivalents annually. At the new fee structure, transit revenue reaches $30 billion annually, up from $5 billion currently. The $25 billion increase comes directly from landlocked neighbors. Their import costs rise. Their export competitiveness falls. Their development trajectories slow. Kenya profits from geography and infrastructure that Kenya didn't fully fund. At 1 p.m. Nairobi time on January 22nd, President Ruto defended the initiative in a national address. Kenya has subsidized regional trade for too long. Our ports, our roads, our railways serve nations that contribute nothing to their maintenance. The era of Kenyan sacrifice for regional benefit ends today. Our infrastructure serves Kenyan interests first. Regional interests follow, at prices that reflect true costs. The speech positioned Kenya as victim rather than aggressor, a nation finally claiming fair compensation after decades of exploitation. The framing resonates domestically, even as it enrages neighbors. Less than 30 days separate today from the point where the new fee structure takes full effect. The implementation timeline creates immediate crisis for importers who contracted at old rates. Shipping contracts typically commit prices months in advance. Ugandan manufacturers have purchase orders assuming $420 per TEU transit costs. Those orders now face $2,510 per TEU costs. The margin destruction is immediate and unavoidable. At 3 p.m. Kampala time on January 22nd, I spoke with the managing director of a Ugandan manufacturing company that imports components from China for assembly into finished goods. The company employs 1,400 workers. Our business model is destroyed. We import $14 million in components annually, roughly 2,800 containers. At old rates, transit costs were $1.2 million. At new rates, transit costs are $7 million. Our total profit margin last year was $3 million. The fee increase exceeds our entire profit. We cannot operate. I asked about alternatives. There are no alternatives at scale. We could route through Dar es Salaam, but the southern corridor adds 3 weeks to delivery time, and the Tanzanian port is already congested. We could try Djibouti via Ethiopia, but that route doesn't connect to Uganda practically. Mombasa is the only viable option. Kenya knows this. That's why they can charge whatever they want. I asked about the company's future. We're meeting tomorrow to discuss whether to continue operations. If we absorb the cost increase, we lose money on every unit. If we pass the cost to customers, we become uncompetitive against imports from Kenya, which don't pay transit fees. The initiative doesn't just raise our costs, it makes Kenyan manufacturers our competitors with structural cost advantages. The competitive distortion is a feature, not a bug. Kenyan manufacturers pay no transit fees because their goods don't transit. Regional competitors pay $2,510 per container. The fee structure systematically advantages Kenyan production over regional production. When nations weaponize geography, regional integration fractures. The East African Community, the trade bloc uniting Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan, now faces existential stress. The EAC was designed to reduce trade barriers and integrate regional economies. The initiative violates EAC principles by creating barriers that didn't exist last week. The violation is flagrant, undisguised, and apparently unconstrained by treaty obligations. At 5 p.m. Arusha time on January 22nd, the EAC Secretariat issued a statement calling the initiative inconsistent with community principles and requesting Urgent consultative meeting of partner state heads. The statement's weakness revealed the institution's limits. The EAC has no enforcement mechanism. Kenya can violate community principles without sanction beyond diplomatic criticism. The criticism doesn't change the fee structure. At 7 p.m. Dar es Salaam time, Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan made a significant announcement. Tanzania would immediately expand Dar es Salaam port capacity and offer preferential fees to regional partners seeking alternatives to northern routes. The announcement was strategically timed. Tanzania has long competed with Kenya for regional transit traffic. The initiative creates opportunity by driving traffic toward alternatives Kenya's pricing makes attractive. But Tanzanian capacity expansion takes years. New berths, new cranes, new rail connections, infrastructure that cannot be built in time to help landlocked nations facing 30-day implementation. At 9 p.m. Nairobi time on January 22nd, satellite imagery showed unusual activity at the Mombasa port. Security personnel were being deployed to container yards. Surveillance equipment was being installed at access points. The deployment suggested Kenya anticipated resistance, possibly smuggling attempts to avoid the new fees, possibly protests from affected businesses. The security posture confirmed Kenya's understanding that the initiative creates conflict. The conflict is accepted because the revenue justifies the cost. What the informed understand is that Kenya's initiative represents a model for geographic leverage that other nations will study and potentially replicate. Every choke point has a controller. Every controller can monetize control. The decision to monetize, or not, reflects calculation about sustainable extraction levels. Kenya calculated that 498% fee increases are sustainable because landlocked neighbors have no alternatives. The calculation may prove correct, or the calculation may provoke responses that destroy the value being extracted. Possible responses include accelerated alternative development, the Lamu Corridor, the Dar es Salaam expansion, the Djibouti-Addis route, each receives new urgency. Investment that seemed prohibitively expensive at old Mombasa prices looks rational at new prices. Kenya's fee increase funds its own replacement. Political realignment. Landlocked nations may seek alliances that pressure Kenya diplomatically. Chinese influence in the region, already substantial through infrastructure financing, may increase as nations seek counterweights to Kenyan leverage. Economic restructuring. Nations dependent on imports may pursue import substitution strategies that reduce transit volumes. The reduction harms Kenyan revenue while developing domestic capacity. Collective bargaining. Landlocked nations acting together have leverage that individual nations lack. A coordinated trade boycott of Kenya would harm Kenya more than any single nation's retaliation. At 11 p.m. Kampala time on January 22nd, regional trade ministers began informal consultations on collective response. The consultations were not announced publicly, but diplomatic sources confirmed the discussions were occurring. The collective response most discussed: a unified demand that Kenya reduce fees to maximum 50% above pre-initiative levels, with threat of coordinated economic measures if Kenya refuses. The threat's credibility depends on landlocked nation willingness to sustain pain. Kenya can survive regional boycotts longer than landlocked nations can survive without port access. The leverage remains asymmetric even in collective action scenarios. At 1 a.m. Nairobi time on January 23rd, I spoke with a Kenyan economic advisor who participated in the initiative's development. The advisor spoke on condition of anonymity. Regional complaints were expected. The complaints don't change the calculation. Landlocked nations need our ports more than we need their transit revenue. They will complain, they will threaten, and they will pay. The fees reflect what the market will bear. The market will bear these fees because it has no choice. I asked about long-term consequences. Long-term, alternatives will develop. We've modeled this. Dar es Salaam expansion takes 5 years minimum. Lamu takes 8 years. For the next 5 years, we capture maximum value. After alternatives emerge, we adjust pricing to remain competitive. The strategy is time-limited by design. I asked about regional relationships. Relationships are transactional. Kenya has provided subsidized transit for decades. Our regional partners didn't treat that as relationship building. They treated it as entitlement. Now they'll pay market rates. If they resent it, their resentment doesn't change their options. The advisor's candor revealed the calculation underlying the initiative. Kenya expects resentment. Kenya doesn't care. The leverage is sufficient to ignore the resentment. The shipping container weighs about 5,000 pounds empty. Fill it with goods, machinery, medicine, food, materials, and it weighs up to 67,200 pounds. Each container represents commerce, represents livelihoods, represents the thread connecting landlocked populations to global markets. 300 million people live in nations dependent on Kenyan transit. Their access to imported goods, medicine that saves lives, machinery that builds economies, consumer products that provide comfort, routes through Mombasa. Their access to export markets, coffee, minerals, manufactured goods, routes through the same port. The container doesn't know it's a weapon, it just holds cargo. But control of where containers flow, at what price, under what conditions, that control is power. That power is now being exercised. $2,510 per container, 498% increase, 30 days to implementation. The numbers describe extraction that landlocked nations cannot avoid and cannot afford. The extraction will slow development, increase poverty, and widen the gap between coastal and interior Africa. Kenya profits, 300 million people pay. The container moves through the port, processed by workers who don't set policy, loaded by cranes that don't consider consequences. The system operates. The fees are collected. The leverage compounds. One container at a time. One fee at a time. One nation's geography monetized at the expense of nations without coastlines. The initiative is legal. Kenya can set port fees as Kenya chooses. Sovereignty permits the extraction even if justice condemns it. But legal and sustainable are different concepts. The initiative may be legal and still provoke responses that destroy its value. The resentment building across the region may express itself in ways Kenya's models didn't anticipate. 30 days until implementation. 5 years until alternatives emerge. 300 million people caught between those timelines. The container waits at the dock. The fee is calculated. The payment is extracted. And East Africa discovers what it means when one nation holds the keys to an entire region's economic future and decides to charge whatever it wants. $2,510. That's the price of geography now. That's what Kenya decided 300 million people will pay for access to the sea. The container doesn't care. The people inside those landlocked borders care very much. But caring doesn't create coastlines, and Kenya has the only coastline that matters.